Welcome to Dr. Rosner's A Second of Context. Ever have a light bulb moment? I do sometimes. And today I have one regards to media history that I would like to share with you in this moment. So take a second and look at the image of this man. Do you have any idea who he is? Probably not. His name is Vint Cerf, and he's commonly referred to as the father of the internet. But what does that even mean? One person created the internet? I don't think so. If you're skeptical of this notion of the father of some invention, the father of some new media device, you're right to be skeptical. Because as we know, one person didn't invent the internet. No, in fact, the invention of the internet was predicated upon a series of technological developments. And so Vint Cerf was carrying on in that tradition. What he did offer the community of inventors that were working towards developing the internet was something called the Internet Transfer Protocol, which was his, with regards to his work on ARPANET and this notion of packet switching, right? So it's important to note that the internet, it comes out of this Cold War mentality where you don't want all of your information stored in one place. Now, if you're skeptical of this notion of one father of an invention, you're right to be, but it's a common trope in media history. Let's explore it a little bit more in depth. So we see it at the foundation of new media technology. Do you know who this person is? Anyone? Well, first of all, it's in the slide there. It's Johann Gutenberg, and he gave us the printing press in 1436, or so the story goes. In reality, Johann had a partner, and he also had someone who was financing his project. And that was an individual by the name of Johann Fust. And Johann Fust decided to call in his debt right before the invention was created. So ultimately what that meant for Gutenberg is, even though we know his name today as the inventor of this profound piece of technology that radically transformed our world and took us from more of an oral scribal culture to a print culture, right? One in which authoritarian power was disrupted. I mean, I could go on and on about that. But even though we know him very well today in association with this invention, in reality, because his debt was called in, he died pretty much penniless and alone not long after the development of the printing press. All right, so you think maybe that trope continues, and if so, you're right. It continues right into the development of the telegraph. Now, the development of the telegraph was predicated upon the development of electricity and that theory. So in reality, one person didn't invent the telegraph, but one person is associated with it, and that's a gentleman by the name of Samuel F.B. Morse. And the story goes that he invents the telegraph in 1831, but that's not true at all. First of all, it took him years and years of research to develop the telegraph, right? And he was working on the concept of sending signals via electric waves, rather an electrical cord, through time and space, right? And so what some people were thinking is that we would have to have a cable for every single letter in the alphabet. But basically what Samuel F.B. Morse saw was that instead, if you just interrupt or disrupt the flow of electricity in this cable, it creates a sound, a dit and a da, dit da, dit, dit, dit da. And it looks like a dot and a dash on the piece of paper, and he gave us Morse code. And that allowed us to effectively communicate through an electric cable across the continent. And it was vastly revolutionary in terms of a communication, new media communication device, because for the first time ever in our whole global history, communication was no longer tied directly to transportation. Prior to this time, communication was tethered to how far your voice could carry in any given space or how quickly you could move across a space. But now you could be in Atlanta, Georgia, and interrupting the flow of this electric device, and you could transmit a piece of communication to San Francisco. It was really earth-shattering, right? But it's important to understand one person didn't invent that piece of technology. So ever heard of the radio? Well, sometimes we listen to it in the car, right? Largely, we know this gentleman in front of us, Marconi, to be the inventor of the radio. But in fact, that's not true at all. There are a number of individuals who are working with the piece that you saw a moment ago, the telegraph, to engage in wireless telegraphy. So the telegraph, that capability of transmitting messages electrically, but sans the wires, because who wants a cord really? Who wants a wire? Right? And so basically what Marconi does is he's working in concert with an inventor named Tesla. And he and Tesla are both working to transmit electric signals without wires, so wireless telegraphy. And ultimately, the reason we associate Marconi's name with the invention instead of Tesla or instead of some of the other individuals who made significant contributions to the technology, such as Reginald Fessenden, the reason that we associate this man's name with it is because the patent company declared that he was the inventor of the radio, okay? And in fact, there were patent disputes during this period of time, but he gets that designation because he transmits the first successful wireless transmission across the transatlantic. So that's why he gets this incredible designation. In reality, as I said, a number of people are contributing to the development of these technologies. And as I said in the second slide related to Gutenberg, a lot of technologies require significant contributions financially to their development. And so that's the case with the telegraph. The Congress actually designates some money to start with the development of the telegraph. And in this case, the United States government invests significantly in the development of radio. And what we see is that's not always the case. The government doesn't always invest in a piece of technology. Instead, it's based upon whether they see it to be a profitable investment for their agenda. So the case with both the telegraph and the radio is it accompanied a time of war. And during that time of war, the government saw the capability of this new piece of media technology to change the dynamics of that war. And so that's why the government was willing to invest in the telegraph and to invest in the radio. Now, this notion of one person inventing a particular piece of technology, it continues right through the development of the television, which we know was being developed in the 20s and 30s by an individual such as Philo T. Farnsworth, who gave us the video tube and the image dissector that helped television as a concept come to fruition. And we know that the television was debuted at the 1939 World's Fair in New York. But what we saw in the case of the TV, a number of people were working to develop it, but the government never saw its practical application for our purposes in World War II. And so what we saw was they didn't finance it well, and the development of the TV was stalled during the period between 39 and the end of World War II. And we didn't see television really take off from a cultural standpoint into the 1950s and 60s. But that's just a little bit of insight into this idea of one person as the father of invention, it's really important, as we know, to always constantly be critically thinking about concepts that we encounter in the world. And so this notion of one person as an inventor is a flawed one. Invention doesn't happen in a vacuum. That's my light bulb moment that I wanted to share. Ready for an extra tidbit? The extra tidbit is this. With each piece of new media technology, there's typically a similar response. Some people in the community will say, this is going to save the world. Woohoo, the internet, right? That's the kind of mentality that accompanied the internet. Or some people are going to say, this is going to contribute to the downfall of mankind. Right? So it might be a democratic force, or it could be the world is going to end. In fact, most pieces of media technology have some sort of middling effect on our culture. And that's certainly been the case with the internet. It has certainly not been a democratic force as it was envisioned by some of the individuals like Vint Cerf who were associated with its development. Instead, what we've seen which was true of the radio, remains true of the internet, which is corporations very quickly recognized how they might harness the potential of a new media technology and to harness it for their advantage. And ultimately, what we've seen is that we've seen a major gap in terms of those disadvantaged populations have not been able to harness it as effectively as some of the individuals who created it foresaw. Moreover, there's one other thing that I wanted to share with you today, and that's this notion that anytime there's a competing new medium on the scene, so as was the case with the radio, or as was the case with TV, or as was the case with online news, we have this moment in the industry. It's a holy shit moment, as I like to call it. And basically what it is we are very threatened by a competitor. Oftentimes we do one of two things. We decide to invest in that technology within the news industry, or we don't invest in that technology. So a lot of newspaper publishers chose to invest in radio and television. So a good example of this would be E.W. Scripps. That family conglomerate chose to invest in radio and also in television. But sometimes we don't choose to invest. There's a great piece in Vanity Fair called How the Internet Was Won. And it talks about this notion of internet developers going and knocking on the doors of major legacy news publishers in the 80s and 90s and asking them to be a part of the internet development, asking them to fund it and to harness it for their main mission of news dissemination. And essentially there was a rejection of that notion. News publishers were not willing to invest in the internet properly at the beginning. And what we saw is it ultimately, the rise of the internet and online news and networks, it ultimately created a scenario where their funding model with regards to circulation and advertising was disrupted completely. And all because they failed to do what some of their predecessors had done and invest in the piece of new media technology. Now, because that's the case, when there does become a competing medium, a lot of times in the news industry, we attempt to discredit that news medium. So that happened in the 1930s with the newspaper radio war. So newspaper publishers who didn't have holdings in radio networks, they attempted to discredit the news that was being aired on radio, and also just radio in general, as an uncredible medium. And then we saw it again with television. So newspaper journalists and radio journalists, even in the trade publications, attempted to discredit television news when it came on the scene in the 50s. So there's kind of a long tradition of a few things. One, this idea of inventors claiming that get credit for, well, I misspoke a little bit. There's this tradition of one person being credited with a new media technology when in fact that's not the case. There's this trend that we see a new media technology in a very binary way, right? It's going to save the world, it's going to end the world. There's a trend to discredit news media in the form of new media technology when we haven't bought into it in the industry. And all of those trends are present within our system. So it's really important to look at the system as a whole and to critically evaluate every piece of information that we come into contact with. So I know that that was more than a few seconds, but thank you for taking a second for context.